Hello and welcome. My name is Jiso Yoon of the Center for International Development and Cooperation at Korean Women's Development Institute. I will be moderating today's webinar. I'd like to extend my warm welcome to all the presenters and participants to this webinar on Building Back Better and Women's Political Empowerment in Asia, women's political representation and reserved seats and political party quotas in the Indo-Pacific region. This forum is co-hosted by the Korean Women's Development Institute and the Embassy of Australia in Korea. Our goal for hosting this forum is very simple and clear. Women's full and equal participation is essential for achieving gender equality and sustainable development globally. But we know that women still remain marginalized in the public sphere, and the situation is particularly problematic in Asia. Therefore, the goal is to locate where Asia countries stand on women's political representation and seek strategies to find out what can be done to increase women's participation and decision-making in the public life. We specifically address these questions in the context of COVID-19, paying attention to some unique challenges that have emerged to women's concerns during the pandemic. Today, we have invited 5 experts to talk on this topic, and I hope you will enjoy their presentations. Please stay till the end and feel free to raise questions and discussion points, as well as I will open the floor for a general discussion when all the presentations are over. And also, I'd like to let you know that simultaneous interpretation is available for this webinar. And so please choose either English or Korean for your language. So before we begin the official program, please allow me to invite President Moon Yu-kyung of the Korean Women's Development Institute to deliver her words of welcome to today's forum. Please welcome her.
Good morning and good afternoon. I am Moon Yu-kyung, President of Korea Women's Development Institute, KWDI. First of all, I would like to extend my deepest gratitude to all of you who participate in this international forum. Today's forum is more meaningful as it is co-hosted by Australian Embassy to Korea. I would like to thank Her Excellency Ambassador Catherine Raper, who provided a strong support for this symposium with great interest in gender issues, and Dr. Alexandria Sedol, who will deliver the keynote speech today. The theme of the symposium is Building Back Better and Women's Political Empowerment in Asia. The idea is to discuss how we can enhance women's political representation in Asia in the post-COVID-19 era. The 65th session of UNCWS addressed women's participation in public decision-making as one of its key topics. Today's forum is part of a series of forums that are organized to commemorate this. During the first forum, which was held late last September, the candidate gender quota system was discussed. This is a system under which all political parties should make sure women take a certain portion of their candidate list. During the forum, the experiences of Korea, Japan, Indonesia, Mongolia, and Timor-Leste were discussed. From their presentations, we could understand that the candidate gender quota led to an increase in female legislators, but there still remains issues such as male-centric political culture and parties' insufficient attention to recruiting supporting female candidates. The second forum will deal with political party quota and reserved seats. Under the political party quota system, a political party determines a quota for female candidates. The system is used in New Zealand, Australia, and the Philippines. Under the reserved seat system, a certain portion of parliamentary seats is allocated to women. The system is being implemented in Nepal and India. During the forum, we will be able to understand women's political representation in these countries and discuss the way forward. The international community puts a strong emphasis on women's participation and leadership in public life, as shown in KWDI, Beijing Platform for Action, as well as Sustainable Development Goals. Unfortunately, however, women in Asia are still underrepresented. The average percentage of female legislators of Asia is only 20.1%. Korea's average is lower than that at 19%, which is much lower than that of European average. Women's political participation is critical to advancing gender equality. Women's equal participation in decision-making process is essential to better respond to the disasters like COVID-19 and climate change and to achieve sustainable development. I sincerely hope that this forum helps us find workable ways to lower the barrier for Asian women's political participation and to strengthen women's political power. The year 2021 marks the 60th anniversary of diplomatic relations between Korea and Australia. I hope that the two countries will continue to cooperate in different areas. KWDI is also looking forward to multifaceted and continuous exchanges with Australian Embassy, including the discussion of gender equality policies. Lastly, I want to thank all the speakers as well as the moderator. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to join you today, and I thank the Korean Women's Development Institute for facilitating today's important webinar. For over 38 years, the KWDI has played an essential role contributing to and promoting women's welfare and participation in Korea and beyond. And today, the work of the Institute is as vital as ever. That's why the Australian Government is pleased to join with the Institute on today's webinar. Today's topic, Building Back Better and Women's Political Empowerment in Asia, is timely and important. Women are agents of change in our societies and our economies. We need women's full and effective participation in political decision-making as equal partners if we are to eliminate violence and achieve empowerment for all women and girls. The Australian Government is firmly committed to these goals in our political and economic advocacy and through our development partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. This effort is no more important than during a pandemic, which we know has already had a disproportionate impact on women and girls. Despite progress, women the world over remain marginalised in politics. In fact, women's representation in our region is the lowest in the world. It's 2021 and, despite years of powerful seminars and marches and speeches in Parliament, we still somehow continue to return to the notion that women's equal representation will simply work itself out. It won't surprise anyone on the line to know this simply isn't the case. Gender equality is not a free market that will correct itself after decades of learned, systemic inequality. And we owe it to the next generation of women leaders to do better, to be better, and to hold those who hold us back to account. Like the many countries represented by participants and attendees in today's webinar, Australia is resolute in our commitment to enhancing women's access to and representation in senior roles, domestically and internationally. As the world responds to and overcomes COVID-19, gender-sensitive policies and leadership must become our new normal, and Australia stands united with all those who dedicate themselves to this essential cause. And for this, I congratulate the KWDI for its exemplary work and wish you every success for today's seminar and the road ahead. Together we can and will ensure women's voices echo as clearly and as resolutely as men's, in parliaments, in boardrooms, in everyday moments that shape the story of equality. Thank you. Kamsahamnida.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for not having a chance to properly introduce Ambassador Catherine Raper of the Australian Embassy in Korea. Ambassador Raper really wanted to be here and join us in this webinar today, but unfortunately she couldn't because she had another engagement, but she kindly sent us her congratulatory remarks in advance. advance so that we could share them with the participants. Well, thank you both President Moon and Ambassador Raper for your kind introductory remarks. Now, I would like to suggest that we open the official program of today's webinar. First, I would like to invite a very special guest, Dr. Alexandra Sido, Deputy Head of Mission of the Australian Embassy in Korea, to our program. If I may give a few words as an introduction, well, KWDI has been exchanging dialogues with the Embassy of Australia in Korea for the past few years, although this is actually our first attempt to co-organize an official international forum together. And this collaboration was made possible by the will and enthusiasm of both organizations to work together as partners to promote gender equality in the Asian region. And against this backdrop, we have asked Dr. Sido of the Australian Embassy in Korea, who is both an international relations scholar as well as a career diplomat, to deliver a keynote speech on this theme. Please welcome Dr. Sido to our forum.
Thank you very much, President Moon, for your introductory remarks, and Ms. Yoon for moderating today's event. I'd like to echo the words of the Ambassador and begin with a heartfelt thank you to the Korean Women's Development Institute. When President Moon and I met earlier this year, we discussed the need for strong institutions, just like KWDI, in both our countries. Institutions that shape policy and shine a light on challenges that, remarkably still in 2021, many in our society somehow fail to recognise. The values case for gender equality does not need to be made. It is patently obvious, but regrettably, it is still not universally observed. If we've learnt anything from our collective work promoting and advancing gender equality to date, it is that some people and some outdated views may simply never change. And that is a genuine shame. But it is also important to remember that recognising this sad reality is not defeatist. In fact, I would say it is the very opposite. Because no matter the immovable and outmoded the views out there, the truth is they're not only diminishing, but they will never stop our drive for progress. We don't need to change every mind to know that we are on the right side of history. That's simply not our job. Today, I'm delighted that we have some highly respected women on the line who I look forward to hearing from shortly. And I feel honoured to be in such esteemed company for this important forum on how we can build back better and advance women's empowerment in Asia. If I could summarise everything I want to say today into only one sentence, it would be this. When it comes to achieving women's empowerment, it's not just enough to remove the barriers preventing women from entering parliaments or positions of power. We must also create gender-sensitive parliaments, supportive enough to nurture and retain the women in them. It's a two-track approach, and it's about far more than women's participation. It's about committing to transformation. I'd like to share with you today some personal views on how we might collectively achieve both participation and transformation, the status of these challenges in Australia's Parliament, and what we might all take away from this. Australia is a firm and consistent advocate for gender equality, and we engage on these issues bilaterally and in global and regional fora. In a former role as the Director of Human Rights and Indigenous Affairs within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, I was proud to develop Australia's position on gender equality for our membership of the Human Rights Council in 2018 to 2020. This prioritised the fight for gender equality worldwide. Australia has long been known as a leader on gender equality, on the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and in forging the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Our Ambassador for Women and Girls, and indeed our ambassadors the world over, are important international advocates for this cause. But let's backtrack for a moment. Why are we all here today? Because when it comes to equality, we're not there yet. The ambassador mentioned that women make up just 20% of members in parliaments throughout Asia. Australia can claim a trifle more than this, with 32% of our elected representatives women, and women comprise 51.3% of our upper house senators. Promising, but we are still a long way from gender parity. We've had just one woman Prime Minister, the Honourable Julia Gillard, who served from 2010 to 2013. Ambassador Raper is the first woman to hold the role of Australian Ambassador to the Republic of Korea in the entire 60 years of diplomatic relations between our two countries. We naturally stand proudly behind our progress and the many courageous, trailblazing Australian women who have shaped our country's story on gender. But Australia is in no position to lecture others on gender equality, nor would we choose to. Instead, what I hope we can do today is look at Australia as a living example of gender-centric policy making in action and how it continues to evolve. So, why is women's representation in leadership so low? What are the barriers? Over the years, I've faced a raft of incorrect and frankly insulting assumptions to justify the status quo. I've been told I'm too emotional. I've been told I'm not experienced enough. I've been told that women will only leave and have children. As a mother of two, I won't even dignify this with a response. There is plenty of evidence to the contrary that can speak for itself. Australia's Workplace Gender Equality Agency released a report last year on the positive impact of women's participation in high levels of the private sector. I'd like to share with you a couple of insights and let the facts speak for themselves. The report showed that increasing the representation of women on the boards of Australian listed companies by 10 percentage points resulted in a 4.9% increase in company market value. That is the equivalent of $78.5 million Australian, or 52.6 million if you want to have the American currency. That is for the average company. This is no small change. Further to this, the review found that the appointment of a female CEO led to a 5% increase in the market value of Australian companies, the equivalent, on average, of 79.6 million Australian dollars. These same companies saw almost a 13% increase in the likelihood of outperforming their sector on 3 or more metrics. It doesn't take a genius to recognise that the benefits of women in leadership in the private sector are directly transferable to public office, with potentially even greater effect. So if the results of the value of women in leadership are this striking, why do our parliaments still lag on gender? There are, of course, countless factors, and I won't risk oversimplifying such a complex issue in such a short address. But one of those factors, in my view, is that we've been preoccupied with too long for rationalising and arguing the value of women in leadership to people who will simply never change. To date, we've approached this problem exactly how we thought we should. It's how we were taught to. But when that doesn't gain traction, we need a new approach. We need a new mantra. Prove us wrong. Let women in. Let our voices resonate with the same volume and gravitas of our male counterparts, and let us fail. And then you can tell us you told us so. But we won't fail. As the Workplace Gender Equality Agency rightly showed, women's success is everyone's to share. In my ministry, the Foreign Ministry, when it comes to promoting women or considering flexible work arrangements to support families, we have a similar approach. We ask, if not, why not? I think our parliaments could benefit from a more healthy dash of this. But what would this look like in functional terms? These days, the simplest and most effective way to reach equality is still through a quota system. The 40-40-20 system is a terrific starting point. This is, of course, with the goal of producing a parliament where no less than 40% of seats are filled by women and no less than 40% by men, with the remaining filled by candidates of either gender. This approach is by no stretch a rejection of the merit-based recruitment. No. Instead, it offers us a way to equal out the structural and institutional inequalities. Since the 1990s, over 100 countries have recognised the value in this approach and implemented political gender quotas. By 2013, over half the world's countries had adopted some form of quota system. Currently, 7 out of the top 10 countries with the highest ranking of women's representation in Parliament have embraced quotas. Simply put, it works. Australia, which ranked 50th on this list, does not currently employ a national quota system, although some of our political parties have adopted voluntary quotas. There is always more that we can do. And one of those things is creating gender-sensitive parliaments. In parallel to women's participation, we need to take steps to nurture and retain the women we attract. This means parliaments, whose structures, operations, method and work must respond to the needs and interests of both men and women. This is another area where institutionally Australia has made significant progress over the past decade to accommodate parents, and we continue on this journey. Our Parliament House now has childcare services and a breastfeeding room off to the side of both chambers for new mothers and new fathers. Breastfeeding mothers can also vote by proxy in our House of Representatives. These are critical steps towards gender-sensitive parliaments. But the moment we think there is no more progress to be made is the moment we fall. Just last week, Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner Kate Jenkins released a landmark report that found 1 in 3 workers in Parliament have faced sexual harassment. 84% of those did not seek support or advice. Despite this and other shocking statistics, this report is something we actually look to with pride. That is because the Jenkins Review represents a wholesale change of strategy and calls for leadership and accountability across Australia's diverse parliamentary ecosystem. This new roadmap is grounded in the testimony and experiences of more than 1,700 people, including 147 former and current parliamentarians. The review has made 28 recommendations, including the establishment of a new Office of Parliamentarian Staffing and Culture, designed to provide centralised human resources support, policy development, training, advice, education, as well as the creation of an independent Parliamentary Standards Commission. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, welcomes the Jenkins Review. He said, "The Parliament of Australia should set the standard for the nation and reflect the best practice in the prevention of and response to any instances of bullying, sexual harassment or sexual assault." The Australian Government has recognised that every single Australian has the right to feel and to be safe at work, and that practical and cultural changes are necessary to make our parliamentary workplaces safer. The Prime Minister has committed to a multi-party approach to implement significant reforms in coming months. If we wish to continue making progress, we need to be unafraid of continuing to shine a light on the very ugliest parts of our system, because admitting faults is just as worthy as our celebration of fixing them. Australia is committed to continuing this important work, and we acknowledge the need to attract and retain more women into leadership positions, both in our Parliament and the private sector. In April, we launched our second National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. Guiding us to 2031, the NAP will ensure that Australia continues to contribute to the protection and promotion of women and girls' human rights, the prevention and resolution of conflict, and the establishment of enduring peace. Women's full, equal and meaningful participation in peace and security remains at the centre of our efforts, both at home and abroad. We know gender equality is a politically and culturally sensitive area that requires the careful analysis of the gender and political economy in each country. It requires us to commit to do no harm and to consider the challenges faced by countries in or emerging from fragility and conflict. We know we cannot transform our world unless the place of women within it is transformed, and we must integrate gender equality across all sectors and all areas. This means hardwiring women's empowerment into everything we do and holding ourselves accountable. So I call on all of you here today to challenge your systems, to prove you wrong, and to embrace the idea of if not, why not? I look forward to participating and listening to the thoughts from our remaining speakers today, and of course, participating in the Q&A session afterwards. Thank you again to KWDI for hosting today's seminar and for the generous time you've taken to listen to my remarks. 감사합니다.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Seidel, for your wonderful and insightful speech on this topic. Without further ado, I'd like to invite the 5 speakers who are experts on this theme of women's empowerment and representation. Because we have limited time, I would like to ask all speakers to keep your presentations to less than 15 minutes, and please keep in mind that I might interrupt you because I will be keeping the time, so I might interrupt you during your presentation and ask you to wrap up your speech if we seem to be running out of time. So our first speaker is Professor Katrina Lee Koo, who is Associate Professor of International Relations at Monash University in Australia. The title of her presentation is Navigating Gender Politics in Australia's Political Leadership, Quotas, Cultures, and the Movement for Change. Professor, could you start?
네, 카타리나 이구 교수님 발표 부탁드립니다.
I think you're muted.
제가 음소거를 해놓고 있었습니다.
Yeah.
My apologies.
양해 부탁드립니다.
Thank you very much. Please let me begin by also thanking the Korean Women's Development Institute for the invitation to speak to you all today. I'm speaking from Monash University, based in Melbourne, on the lands of the Kulin Nation. So I'll be looking at the issues of quotas in Australia within the broader context of cultures, political cultures of leadership and movements for change, especially within the Australian Parliament. So the treatment and the experiences of women who work in Parliament, both as members of Parliament but also as political staffers, has been a significant news item over the past few years. This is partly because of the underrepresentation of women in Parliament, but it's also because of what some have described as a toxic work culture within Parliament House that has negatively and uniquely impacted women. In recent years, a number of women politicians have left the Australian Parliament, citing the poor treatment of women as one of the reasons for their resignation. And inevitably, these two issues have been linked: the treatment and experiences of women in Parliament on the one hand, and the underrepresentation of women on the other hand. But before getting into these two issues, let me begin with some basic facts. And I thank Dr. Siddle for providing an overall view of the situation in Australia. In terms of raw numbers, Australia has improved over recent years. Women currently form 38% of the Australian Parliament overall. And what we're seeing is that the upper house is performing particularly well, with 53% in the Australian Senate. And the lower house, we're seeing 31% of women. On this slide, you can see how this is divided between the main political parties. So in Australia, the current government is formed by a Liberal National Coalition, and the current opposition party is the Australian Labor Party. You can see particularly that the Labor Party is performing better than the Liberal Party in terms of the representation of women. And thinking about this globally, it places Australia slightly ahead of like-minded allies, the UK, the US and Canada, in terms of the number of women in the Parliament, although we'll be lagging behind New Zealand, and Professor Curtin will talk to that, I think, in a few minutes. So as you can see from the slide, the current government, the Liberal National Party, are performing particularly poorly in terms of the representation of women. Now, for some, the reason for this is that the Australian Labor Party, the current opposition party, introduced a quota system in the mid-90s, and that has increased the number of women. So in 1994, the Australian Labor Party adopted a mandatory 30% pre-selection quota for women in winnable seats at all elections. In 2012, they updated this with a 40-40-20 system, and Dr. Siddle talked about this in other contexts, where at least 40% of seats would be held by women, 40% by men, and then the other 20% could be either. In 2015, the Labor Party set itself a target of reaching 50% of female representation by 2025. Their current rate of female parliamentary representation sits at 47.9%, and this places them arguably on track to be able to reach that quota. The Liberal Party has set itself a target of 50% female representation by 2025 as well. However, they have not adopted a quota system. Overwhelmingly, they have historically been opposed to the ideas of quotas. Different parliamentarians over the years have described quotas as inherently unfair, as undemocratic. They argue that political representation must remain in the hands of the voters and should not be interfered with or manipulated by political parties. So until very recently, they've consistently argued for what they describe as a merit-based approach, arguing that there should be equality of opportunity in terms of opportunities to stand for election, rather than equality of outcomes in terms of who is elected. So their focus instead has not been on targets, but on trying to encourage grassroots and party-focused sponsorship, or what they describe as mentoring of women candidates, to build women's candidates' capacity to stand competitively for election. So many argue that this is a kind of process which is designed to get women to the starting line and to get them in a competitive position to be able to stand for election. But of course, this is an issue of much debate, particularly because the Liberal Party has only seen very small gains in terms of women's representation at the federal level. It's important to note, however, that the Prime Minister has also made important steps in appointing women to Cabinet. So Australia currently has 8 of its 23 Cabinet Ministers being women. This is important because it's the largest proportion of women we've seen in the Australian Cabinet. And importantly, we've also seen in recent years women appointed to senior portfolios within the government, particularly the Department of Defence as the Minister for Defence and the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade. However, the current rate of female representation in the Liberal Party remains low at 21.7%. And the Prime Minister has admitted recently that the efforts over the years to increase the number of women hasn't been especially effective. So in this slide, you can see the gap that has emerged between the two major parties in terms of female representation since the introduction of quotas by the Australian Labor Party in the mid-1990s. So the Labor Party is represented in red there, and the Liberal Party is represented in blue. And much of the debate has been around this issue of quotas, with a lot of research and evidence suggesting that the introduction of the quota system by the Labor Party has been the primary driving factor for the significant increase of women's representation within that party. The quota system is supported by both male and female members of the Labor Party. It was introduced without a great deal of controversy or concern and has remained a central and uncontroversial part of the Labor Party policy regarding issues of pre-selection and party representation. But it has also, to some extent, been critical of the attitudes of the Liberal Party with regards to claims of a merit-based system. And on the bottom of this slide, I have a quote from a former Western Australian Premier, Carmen Lawrence, who I think encapsulates a lot of the existing research around the politics or idea of a merit-based system, when she says that I think the idea that people are selected on merit and promoted on merit is a convenient fiction. And in fact, I think it's one that does damage to our democracy, because the idea that you have to have certain characteristics and qualifications in order to be selected as a representative is simply wrong. So the Prime Minister of Australia currently is under increasing pressure to address this stagnation in terms of women's representation. And you can see from the graph here that it has remained reasonably stagnant between sort of 20 and about 27%. He's also under increasing pressure, as Dr. Siddell mentioned, to address what's seen as the toxic workplace culture in Parliament, which has reportedly influenced the early retirement of a number of Liberal MPs in recent years. So there is two issues that are becoming interconnected. One is about ensuring opportunity and ability for women to be elected into Parliament, but the second is being able to retain them once they're elected by having appropriate workplace cultures, structures, and institutions. And increasingly in Australia, these two issues are being linked. The culture of Parliament is being seen as a reason for the early departure of women representatives, and particularly the unwillingness of young women to see politics as a viable career. So recent research has showed that young women between the ages of about 15 and 25 do not see politics as a viable career choice for them. So in turn, addressing the cultural issues is seen as a way of encouraging more women into Parliament. Now, Dr. Siddell has already talked about the release in the past few weeks by the Australian Human Rights Commission of the Set the Standard report. This was a report that followed an inquiry into parliamentary workplace culture, which was the sort of culmination of a series of issues, but in particular, a complaint by a former Liberal Party staffer that she had been raped in Parliament House, and that there had been efforts on the part of the government and the political party to essentially cover over this issue. But the inquiry is an important step. It involved, as Dr. Siddell said, 1,700 people, and it also had some rather horrifying statistics, including that more than half of those who work in Parliament House had experienced at least one incident of bullying, sexual harassment, or actual or attempted sexual assault at work, and that 4 in 10 women had reported a form of sexual harassment. So there are these issues associated with the political leadership culture and the parliamentary culture. One is about the culture in Parliament House itself, but also there have been discussions around cultures of violence against female MPs. Recently, the Greens Senator Sarah Hanson-Young has concluded a defamation case against her colleague, Senator David Leyonhjelm of the Liberal Democratic Party, in which she had claimed defamation on the basis of the use of sexist language in the Senate chamber, and she was awarded $120,000. But also there are concerns about subgendered institutions and structures and a lack of family-friendly working structures. And Dr. Siddell has talked about some of those that are being addressed, but I think COVID has been an opportunity to revisit these issues again, because it shows the extent to which women in Australia still continue to carry the burden of caring responsibilities in the home and in the community, and how that undermines and affects workplace practices. But the need to work from home, to work remotely, has also shown the opportunities that Parliament and other institutions can have in terms of adopting family-friendly structures and ways of working. So in terms of ways forward, I think there are 3 things that we can talk about. I mean, firstly, there has been major pressure on the Prime Minister and the Liberal Party to think about the value of quotas. There is now enough evidence in the Australian context to show that quotas do have a significant impact on the increase of the representation of women in Parliament, and now quotas are being seriously considered by the Prime Minister. I think there is also pressure on the current government and the government that wins the next election to lead on cultural change. in terms of working for Parliament, which is not simply about the culture, but also changes to the parliamentary working patterns that make it more receptive to diverse groups of people working, particularly people with significant caring responsibilities. I think also these things have led to discussions within the public, not just about the barriers to women's effective political representation, but also to the value of women's leadership. Dr. Siddell talked about the research that exists for women on corporate boards, but increasingly we're understanding that the quality and robustness of public policy and decision making is there when we have a more diverse cohort of parliamentarians. And so there was a genuine understanding of the real value to democracy, to representation, and to ideas of justice when we have a more equal and inclusive parliament. And I'll leave those comments there and look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lee Gu, for your presentation. I followed the presentation very closely because it was interesting, and mainly the part about the discussion on the merit system, because we have the exactly same discussion and debate going on in South Korea right now, within the major conservative party mainly. So I found that very much relevant to the South Korean case. Now, I would like to invite the second speaker, Professor Jennifer Curtin, of Politics at University of Auckland in New Zealand. The title of her presentation is Diversifying Women's Representation in Parliament and Cabinet, Aotearoa, New Zealand's Incremental Approach. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. That's me saying hello and thank you in our Indigenous language, Māori. So I'm really thrilled to be here, and I'd like to thank the Korean Women's Development Institute for inviting me to speak at this symposium today. In this paper, I begin by considering the historical and contemporary context of women in New Zealand politics, what we call descriptive representation. So I'm going to review the numbers of women elected to the New Zealand Parliament, those selected for ministerial positions, and the increasing number of women political leaders of their parties, making them prime ministerial contenders. In many ways, New Zealand looks like a success story, in particular because most recently our woman Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, has made international headlines for all the right reasons during her 4 years in office. But we know from feminist political science scholarship that achieving a critical mass in our parliaments does not happen by itself and does not guarantee better policy outcomes for different groups of women. So because this symposium is about the possibility of building back better, given the current crisis from the pandemic, it's necessary to consider the idea and practice of substantive representation, or acting for and being responsive to different groups of women. In this short presentation, I focus on just two measures of acting for. One focuses on process, speaking for women and potentially championing new ways of working to enable more women into the parliamentary chamber and to view that chamber as welcoming of all those who identify as women or non-binary, so similar to what Katrina talked about. But the other focuses briefly on policy responsiveness during COVID-19. Of course, it's empirically difficult to determine the exact impact that an increased presence of women in the Parliament and in Cabinet has on women-friendly processes and policy outcomes, especially given women are not a single constituency. However, this dilemma only serves to remind us why it is important and necessary to have more women from all parties and from all walks of life, especially Indigenous, migrant, and women from vulnerable communities in our parliaments. So I will conclude by considering, if I have time, what institutional reforms might enable more diverse representation and why we need to continue to advocate for a more inclusive and gender-sensitive political and policy system. So although the struggle for women, by women, for formal political equality was won early by New Zealand, in 1893 we won the right, all women received the right to vote, but it took until 1919 for women to be allowed to stand for Parliament. And it took even longer for women to overcome being underrepresented in politics. And so you will see the statistics there. There was static progress from 1919 when 3 women stood for election, and it took until 1933 before our first woman was elected, our second in 1945, and our third, the first Māori woman in Parliament, took until 1949. In fact, because of our electoral system, which was then first past the post, by-elections became the point of entry for many women. So 7 out of the 16 women elected before 1979 came into Parliament through by-elections. We also know that between 1946 and 1975, approximately 93% of party candidates were men. But we started to see some shifts in 1975 with International Women's Year. Then 46 women stood as candidates, twice as many again in 1972, and 61 stood in 1978. Only 4 were elected in 1975 and 1978, and this doubled to 8 in 1981. This shows over time the glacial progress that women have experienced in terms of entering the New Zealand Parliament. And there are some key points that I note here on my slide about some cultural shifts within parties, but also some institutional changes that have mattered to encouraging and enabling more women to be elected to Parliament. So the Labour Party and the Labour Women's Caucus within that party was instrumental in helping to at least shift the culture of that party in the 1970s and the 1980s. They picketed their own conference. They chose not to adopt a party quota, but instead trained their women to be ready to stand as candidates in safe electorate seats. In 1992 and 93, we had referendums to change our electoral system to a proportional system. And in 1996, we had the first election under our mixed member proportional system. And on the slide, you can see that in 1996, the orange line, the number of female MPs, starts to track up significantly. Part of that story is about Labour and the new women in their caucus, but it's also about the Greens, who have always had a very progressive policy on selecting women, but have also managed now, since proportional representation has come in, to get more women into Parliament. It's not, in fact, until 2013 that Labour sets what I would call a soft quota. In fact, Labour wouldn't call it a quota at all. It's a target of 45% women in its caucus, but most of those women come through the party list. And in question time, I'll answer some questions about why there are some problems with only having women represented in party lists. So this slide shows the differences between which party of the 2 major parties is in government correlated against women's percentage representation. And we see that over time, it's been the Labour Party that has tended to lead the way. And then the blue, which is our centre-right party, follows. And so we see in some senses that the adoption of the PR system works, but so does what follows, which is what I call a contagion effect. And so parties want more support from women voters and male voters. And so they recognise that selecting more women candidates is important. Moving then to Cabinet. So what you'll see in this slide is the percentage of women MPs is the blue line, and the percentage of women ministers is the orange line. And we know that we need more women in Parliament in order to feed the pipeline of women into cabinet. And Helen Clark, our Prime Minister in 1999, set a new high for the percentage of women in cabinet, over 30%. And here again, we see a contagion effect. So we see that after Clark's loses the election in 2008 and a new national centre-right Prime Minister, who's a man, comes into the role, he also selects 30% women into his cabinet, and that level holds throughout his term as Prime Minister. However, we have to remember that not all portfolios are created equal, meaning that not all women have the same degree of power to progress policy change. And also in a proportional representation system, it really depends which party you're going into government with. Coalitions can problematise gender parity in cabinets. And of course, we have to also remember in countries with Indigenous populations and diverse groups of women need representation in these governing bodies. Another thing I would just like to mention is that what our proportional representation environment has brought with it is a different way of thinking about leadership norms. And so we're on to our third woman Prime Minister in New Zealand. But in addition to that, we are starting to see a trend with minor parties or small parties having co-leaders. And we almost always see every party having a deputy leader who is a man or a woman, depending on who the leader is. And this now has taken hold and it's an acceptable norm. But the other norm that's changed that reflects potentially a new culture in Parliament and in politics is our current Prime Minister has embodied a different way of doing leadership and has rhetorically done her leadership differently. So she's been pregnant as a Prime Minister. She's had a baby. She's taken that baby to the UN. She's talked about kindness and care in addition to being adversarial in the Parliament. And she has done a lot of her communication through formal press conferences, but also through Facebook Live and other social media channels. So speaking directly to people about her lived experience, and it's gone down really well with voters under 40. So just quickly, in my last 4.5 minutes, I want to talk about substantive representation. So acting for women and ways in which we might see better ways of doing politics when women are involved. And the first one reflects what the previous speakers have talked about, which is about changing parliamentary culture. And our review happened in 2019 and demonstrated that essentially we also have a toxic gender culture and anti-woman culture in our parliamentary workplaces, but also our MPs experience institutionalised racism. So it's a multiplicity of underlying causes that are leading to bullying, harassment, sexual harassment, and there is significant lack of accountability. And we've seen significant change from within the Parliament in terms of guidelines and rules, but ultimately the parliamentary oversight cannot impact the way political parties work. And it's about party culture as much as it is about parliamentary culture that needs change. And we still have to work that through in the New Zealand context. So it's not all good news. The second substantive representation issue I want to quickly raise is to just put aside for a moment the assumption that having women political leaders and having a lot of women in cabinet will necessarily lead to good, gender-sensitive, gender-inclusive policy outcomes or policy programs. And what we've seen in New Zealand with our recovery packages after COVID is a very business as usual type approach with women on benefits and a lot of lack of recognition of the care economy and social infrastructure, with new money mostly going to physical infrastructure and into a lot of jobs and professions that are primarily male dominated. So what does this tell us? What enables a more diverse parliament? So I'm hoping that my slides will be shared with you, but what I've listed on the left here is a range of institutional and other factors that are likely to have high, medium or low impact on increasing women's representation. And in the right-hand column, I've noted whether New Zealand has had these or has these. And I would say that we have to remember that in some senses that there are waves of activity in civil society and within women's caucuses, but this is not always sustainable. And so rules that are formalized and can become embedded over time, like legalized gender quotas, are important steps, but they in themselves won't shift party culture. And in my final slide, I just list some reasons from the very well-known feminist political scientist Anne Phillips about why it's really important to not assume that it's okay for men to monopolize representation and that they don't have a natural superiority or talent to take that office. And rather than always emphasizing quotas for women, Rainbow Murray has argued that we have to shift the conversation to understanding why we need job descriptions for being a politician and that maybe we need to see quotas for men. History tells us that male domination of executive office has not served women well, and diverse interests warrant representation, even more so now that we're in a time of crisis. The ILO doesn't talk about building back better. It says we need to build forward fairer. And I really like that way of describing it. And I also think, and this is research that I'm working on now, that it's important that political representation can happen by community women leaders as well, and that we need to see women in Parliament and everyone in Parliament partnering up more with those who are doing representation of the grassroots. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I mean, there was a lot of important and interesting information in this presentation, but what I found most helpful or relevant, probably for other participants in the panel today, is this evidence on the impact of institutional change that New Zealand has undertaken, that it undertook, like the change to the PR system and the kind of contagion effect this had on not just one party, but to other governing parties as well. And I think this could be really important and useful piece of information and insight for maybe other activists mobilizing for institutional change in other countries. Thank you very much. Now I would like to invite the third speaker, who is Ms. Adhikari, Research Associate at the Center for South Asian Studies in Nepal. Ms. Adhikari's presentation is titled, very similar to Professor Curtin's actually, Women's Representation in Parliament of Nepal, Substantive or Descriptive. So we will be sharing the slides from our end. And so, Ms. Adhikari, you could start speaking. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to thank Korean Women Development Institute for having me as a speaker for this symposium with such an amazing panel. I myself am Ashiana Adhikari, a research associate at Center for South Asian Studies, Nepal. And thank you so much for sharing the slide. Next slide, please. Okay. Talking about substantive and descriptive representation, I don't think so I have to go so much on it because our previous speaker went through it all. So let me just get into my slide of mentioning you all that did you know that Nepal leads first in South Asia in women's political representation in the parliament. Similarly, it ranks 36th around the world. We might be thinking that Nepal being such a developing country, how come Nepal ranks second in Asia, 36th in the whole world, and first in South Asia? Let's go into the next slide to learn why.
First, the Constitution from the very initial stage ensures the rights of women as a fundamental right under Article 38. This is already a step ahead of many other constitutions, including those in South Asia. Second, Nepal reserves for women 33% of position in Nepal's state institution, including the legislature under Article 84. This is a major breakthrough on an arrangement with other South Asian states. Next. Okay, so just giving a general background, the 2017 local election in Nepal has been hailed as a historical movement for gender equality and political inclusion, with 40% of female representation achieved at the local governance level. So the principle of proportional inclusion of women enshrined in the new constitution of Nepal was operationalized in the form of gender quotas during local elections, which were held for the first time in almost two decades. The Local Election Act mandates in each ward, which is the smallest administrative unit that collectively forms a municipality or rural municipality in the case of villages, that there will be one chair and 4 ward members, 2 of which must be women, including 1 Dalit woman. Additionally, the Act stipulates that political parties must field at least 1 female candidate for the post of either mayor or deputy mayor as a municipality, or chief or deputy chief in case of rural municipality. As a result, women now constitute 40.9% of the total 35,041 local government representatives elected across 753 local levels. Next. So is it inclusion or is it cooptation? Does it mean that because we have a lot of women in the parliament, does it mean that they are being included in all the policy making processes? Next. Like I said, that there is 40.9% of women are now represented in local government. Disaggregated data shows that out of the total female local representatives, 47.4% are Dalits, referred as untouchables in the Hindu caste system. 23.5% are Khas Aryas, including Brahmins and Kshetris, which dominate political, social, and economic realms of Nepal. 19.9% are Janjatis, indigenous people with traditionally non-Hindu culture, language, and religion, and 8% Madhesis, non-hill origin people living in the plain region of Nepal, sharing similarities with North India's. Comparatively, high percentage of Dalit women can be attributed to Dalit women quotas in the form of reserved seats in the membership level. Beyond those quotas, however, Dalit women have negligible presence in other positions such as deputy mayor, which has 91% representation of women, primarily from Khas Arya and Janjati background. In the key decision-making positions as mayor, chief, and ward chair, which were non-quota seats, there are only 2% of women who are represented. Next. So there has been no improvement after the provision of 33% quota, as despite the constitutional provision of 33% of women's representation introduced after 2007, there has been none of all the cabinets formed after 2007 shows that women's representation remains frustratingly low. After the promulgation of interim constitution in 2007, 10 cabinets have been formed, but none has 33% of representation of women. Thus, despite some improvement, women's representation in key decision-making bodies remains low. Women have generally been relegated to the post of deputies in local bodies and state ministers in provincial government. This shows how political parties are not serious about meaningful female participation. They should go beyond tokenism and appoint women to key positions in their party as well as the government. Next. Why are there challenges that women have to face Okay, sorry, this slide I deleted, but it's fine. So what are the motivation of women that lead them to joining into politics? So there is a constellation of interest informed by livelihood negotiation, experience of socioeconomic exclusion, and a complex power dynamics within families and political parties that leads them to join into politics. Next. So quota system. Is it for or against substantive representation? Nepal has put in place provision to include women and members of other marginalized communities in parliament and other state leadership positions. For instance, in Nepal, a woman must serve as either the country's president or vice president, according to the constitution. Similarly, this holds true for the president of the legislature and the chief of judiciary. Also, the mayor or deputy mayor of every municipality must be women. In many cases, it is clear that female candidates are chosen not to empower women, but for the sake of meeting the 33% quota system. Top leaders' personal interests are also prioritized in political recruitment over a candidate's capacity and commitment to the party. Also, gender quotas have attracted a wide spectrum of actors to the new political spaces they have been established. Many of the female candidates have no prior experience in social work or activism, and this is their first foray into the official political sphere. In Nepal's political environment today, which is characterized by patronage and clientelism, there is little doubt that personal political connections play a critical role in gaining entry to and sustaining the durability of women's political journeys. Hence, even when educated female politicians come through the quota system, they are considered as second class citizens and they are not given the respect that they deserve. Next. So, what are the challenges that women face, and why do they face the challenges that they face when they are into the parliament? It is due to historically institutionalized gender discrimination in the parliament and political parties, patriarchal mindsets of the politicians, socially constructed exclusion and behaviors towards women, and lack of trust in women that they can hold the party or they can hold the parliament and have some say and do something for the nation. The Nepalese constitution, on the other hand, guarantees equal rights to all citizens with affirmative action for women and marginalized groups. The truth, however, is that formal equality is insufficient since women and disadvantaged groups are not treated equally when it comes to taking advantage of official chances. Next. So there's a lot of things that come around, like quota system is bringing this change, quota system is bringing that change, and there's a lot of number of women that have entered into parliament, but some women enter into politics to become a voice in the parliament for the voiceless people, while some enter just to become an aid for male politicians or to serve their needs. While Nepal's quota system has been the first step to ensure descriptive representation of women in the country's political system, substantive representation of women requires a change in the attitudes of people, including parliamentarians, regarding women parliamentarians. Men parliamentarians often believe that there is an equal representation and that the quota system has done justice to the women. But they often forget that women are not a homogeneous group. And it is difficult, even within the quota system, for certain categories of female to climb up the political ladder. To remedy this, more diverse women should be encouraged to participate in politics. And because democracy is based on the majority voice, current arrangements are insufficient to protect women's rights. Next. While women have succeeded in achieving higher position in Nepal, the progress accomplished so far are not enough to justify the prevailing inequality in the political system. Having political representation does not equate to the role they have over decision-making process. And sadly, even though we rank second in Asia, we have not been able to capitalize the number of women that we have in the parliament. Thus, women's representation in Nepal still remains descriptive and not representative. Thank you.
Much, Ms. Adhikari, for your presentation. I mean, I hope we get to talk more about this during the discussion session, but I wanted to let you know that Nepal is a very close partner country of KWDI, and so we have very close relationships with different policy experts in Nepal, and it has always thrilled us to kind of realize how Nepal is advanced in terms of gender equality policies and also all kinds of affirmative action measures. But then we are always surprised to find out that there is a gap between the legal system, legal provisions, and the reality. And so I hope to hear a little bit more about this gap during the discussion session later on. Thank you. Our next speaker is Ms. Sudha Ramachandran, who is an independent journalist in India. I'd like to invite her to begin her presentation titled Gender Equality in Indian Legislature, Still a Distant Dream. Ms. Ramachandran, we would like to ask you to speak closely to your microphone so that we can hear you well. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, the Korean Women's Development Institute, for having me on this esteemed panel. So first, I'd like to just give you all a little background about Indian society and, the kind of patriarchal society in which we function. A lot of things have definitely improved over the last 70 years. For instance, with regard to women's literacy and so on, things are improving. Even women's nutrition is improving. Yet, I will have to say that, and again, when you look at India, I mean, we often talk about having a woman, we've had a woman prime minister, women president, women defense minister, foreign minister, and so on. All these are matters of pride. Women are also storming male bastions, many male bastions. Yet there's a lot of concern. And one is that on almost every socio-economic indicator, women are trailing men. Often you find that women are the last to eat in a family. And so often there's no food to eat. You find that nutrition, women are trailing behind men. You find that still, just 1/3 of India's women remain illiterate. And also, the chances of a girl being born, that itself is so difficult. So often, when we discuss the status of women, we often say that women are discriminated against from the womb to the tomb. And that is because, why the womb? It's because female feticide continues to be a matter of grave concern in spite of laws. And this clearly shows that even if you have the most stringent laws, it's very difficult to prevent discrimination and violence against women. Women face violence not just at home, but also outside. So, and all this is really because we have a patriarchal society. There's a lot of misogyny in our society, and hence, women, they start off with a great disadvantage. Now, okay. So very quickly, I'd like to tell you all that about the Indian political system, which is that we have a federal government, federal system, we have a central government, we have state assemblies, and then of course we have the local government. So our lower house of parliament is called the Lok Sabha, and we have about 543 elected representatives here. Now, if you look at India's position, you'll find that with regard to the percentage of women in our Lok Sabha, you'll find that since 2004, it's been rising steadily. Sorry. Sorry. Yeah. So today, we don't have women's, any reservation or quota for women in the Lok Sabha, and you find that clearly women are in a smaller percentage than men. Just in the last election, which was in 2019, we managed to get only about 14% of the women's representatives were women. Of course, this percentage is increasing. In the 2014 election, for instance, it was 12.15, so it's increased to 14. Yet, 14% is simply not enough. Simply because our population, if you compare it to the percentage of the percentage of women in our population, that's about 48%. So clearly, this representation of women in our parliament is simply not enough. Now, so if you look at the number of women who contested in the last election, just 716 women contested, and of these, 78 won. Now, one issue that, those who are opposed to reservation for women, they often say that, well, we can't choose women or put women up as candidates because they are unlikely to win an election. And in a situation where our elections have become so polarized and so fiercely contested, political parties often say that they don't want to put up women candidates because they are unlikely to win. Now, the truth is very different. You look at the statistics, women, the success rate is 10.89. That is, of all the women who stand for elections, almost 11% of the women win. Whereas if you look at the success rate for women, for men, it's just 6.41. So, if only our politicians would look at these figures. And this clearly shows that it's really just, this belief that women can't do well, they won't win, and so on. It's so deeply ingrained that people are unwilling to change. Interestingly, again, when you look at the major political parties, and their positions, India's ruling Bharatiya Janata Party, this is a Hindu nationalist party, which is rather aggressive on women's issues. However, you find that in the 2019 elections, it had the largest number of women of all the parties. It had 40 women MPs compared to the Congress, which is seen to be slightly more progressive and more liberal. Now, the Congress had only 6 women MPs. Of course, this doesn't give you the full picture because the BJP has so many women MPs simply because it won a much larger number of members of parliament as well. Now, now if you look at the percentage, this is the percentage of women in all our state assemblies. And if you look at it, it has not exceeded 2000, it has remained sort of constant at around 8%. And, but the interesting thing is in the state assemblies, we have had very powerful women, chief ministers. There's the Dalit or the scheduled caste chief minister who, she was chief minister Mayawati, which is terrific because, Mayawati comes from the Dalit or the untouchable caste. And she, to come from a very marginalized section of society, and within that caste itself, for a woman to contest and win is phenomenal. So Mayawati has been, a chief minister. We have Mamta Banerjee. Mamta Banerjee has, many of our other women politicians who've made it big are really the daughters or wives of, major male politicians. However, you find that Mamata Banerjee made it as chief minister, and she is a very powerful chief minister. She came up really because she came up on her own steam and her own merit. Then, of course, you have Jayalalitha. She was re-elected several times in the Tamil Nadu State Assembly. In Jammu and Kashmir, Mehbooba Mufti. Now, while most of the others were either, in some way related to powerful men, whether as their partners or daughters or whatever, Mamata Banerjee really stands out as somebody who's really come up from the grassroots and reached this position. So, yeah, and if you look, recently we had state assembly elections in which the TMC, this is Mamata Banerjee's party, it fielded 16% women candidates. While this was much better than the other parties, their willingness to field women, while this was much better, you find that the TMC, the percentage of women it put in the fray has fallen from 41% in the 2019 general election to 16 or 17% in the recent election. These were the number of women candidates who contested. What happened, during this recent election, state assembly elections, one was that women, there were a lot of freebies extended to women. So clearly, these parties and politicians have recognized that women are an important vote bloc. And so, there were many free things that were offered by these political parties, washing machines at home to make life easier for women working at home. So these were clearly targeted at women. However, you find that the kind of misogynistic rhetoric was really disgusting because several leading politicians also were targeting other women politicians. Very demeaning remarks, very, with a lot of sexual innuendo and so on. And that points to an important obstacle in women coming out in politics because it's really seen as a dirty world and nobody wants to be talked badly about. Interestingly, if you look at the state of Kerala, which also voted in state assembly elections, you find that Kerala has terrific socioeconomic indicators, an educated population. It's had left governments, progressive left governments off and on. And yet you find that it put very few women as candidates in the election. So overall, if you look at the kind of women's role in the electoral field, you find that less women are fielded. Then you also, if they are fielded in the elections, they are often given what are unwinnable seats. That is, if a party knows it's going to lose this constituency anyway, then it feels okay. Let's put up a woman from this candidate. However, you find that the vote of women is valued in the sense they are wooed with a number of freebies and so on. Now, interestingly, in a few months, we'll be having another round of elections, crucially in the state of Uttar Pradesh, which is India's most populous, most politically and electorally relevant. It's also the most, I would say, very high crime, I think it tops India in violence against women. So, of course, just a few parties, like the Congress has promised to field 40% of its candidates here. It has said it will field women. But otherwise, the issues that will be important are the caste and the communal issues. So in this election, it would be interesting to see what happens. I mean, the Congress, for instance, its announcement to put up 40% candidates, what impact can it have? It's clear that the leader who announced this, who is Priyanka Vadra, she has said that it's a ploy. It is a ploy in the sense that they are trying. The Congress has lost all its other vote banks, that is, its solid groups that vote for the Congress. Earlier, certain castes backed it, certain religions backed it. Now it has lost all those. So it's likely that it's trying to win the solid votes of women. But is this workable? Will women vote for the Congress? While there's a lot of enthusiasm in the rallies that are going on from women, yet you find that can it win? Can the Congress win? I think it'll have to really work hard, and this seems a little unlikely. For the Congress will need to build a gender identity that transcends the caste and religious identity in the state. Only then will women set aside their caste or communal identities to vote for the Congress. This could bring change. And this could bring change if other parties also join in and offer 40%. The sad thing is that the Congress is a near non-entity in Uttar Pradesh now. It's been reduced to this status. And so it's unlikely that the other parties will also join in. Now, if the other parties also join in, I think that would be a tremendous victory for women. Okay, now, so in India, the third level I had told you all was at the level of local bodies, or what we call the Panchayati Raj institutions. These are village elected bodies and the urban local bodies. Now, an interesting thing is that at this level, India has legislation. In 92, the 73rd constitutional amendment was brought in, and this mandates 33.3% reservation for women in these elected bodies. And, when you look at the working of these institutions in the local bodies, yes, it is not perfect. And yes, you have, often many of the women who have got into these local bodies don't know how to read and write. They seem to be proxies of their powerful husbands. Their husbands are making the decision for the wife, and this is distressing. Yet, once the woman has contested, served one term, there is a change in her capacity, in her confidence, and slowly change is happening in the grassroots because women are, you have 1/3 women. Also, if you look at the kind of issues they are bringing up at the grassroots level. Now, remember rural India, where a number of women are not really educated, but they are trying to bring in change. They are, bringing up issues like water, having tapped water rather than having to walk several miles to collect water every day. So this is very heartening. Also, you find that in some states, around 20 states, you find that in the states, they have increased reservation from 33.3 to 50%. So that's heartening. You also find that in the state of Karnataka, which is the state I come from, we have more than 50% women representation in the Panchayati Raj institutions, which means that women are now winning even in those seats which are not reserved for them. So I think this is a huge, it really shows that once you start empowering women, letting them getting into the political field, they can make a difference.
Ms. Ramachandran, could I ask you to quickly wrap up?
Okay, so we have a women's reservation bill that is to reserve seats in the national parliament and the state assemblies. It was brought in 1996. but it's yet to be enacted in Parliament. And this is really because all our political parties are refusing to allow it to pass in Parliament. And yes, there are caste considerations, and if any of you have any questions regarding that, I could answer it later.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm sure we will have more time to discuss during the discussion on the Indian case. But one thing that really interested me was the point made earlier in this presentation about the success rate of female candidates and male candidates. That when you compare, that actually women do better. You find evidence that women do better, and so this can be used as an evidence to argue against some political parties that say we can't nominate female candidates because they won't have a chance in the elections, right? And I think this is an important message and evidence that can be echoed in other parts of the world as well. And so that was very interesting. Thank you very much. Our final speaker, now I would like to invite our final speaker, Ms. Maya, the co-founder of BAI in the Philippines, Angat BAI in the Philippines. I would like to ask her to start her presentation titled Forging the Future of Feminist Leadership in the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to KWDI. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be part of this incredible panel. So good afternoon, everyone. Annyeonghaseyo. Magandang hapon po. This afternoon, I will be sharing a brief situationer on women's representation in politics in the Philippines. Then I will discuss some of the enabling mechanisms that allow women to participate in the political sphere, and then barriers to women's political participation. And then I will move on to the importance of women's participation in decision making. And lastly, I'll share with you the strides on addressing these barriers through the work of Angat BAI program, which means uplift women. This is largely lifted, the presentation is largely lifted from the study I've conducted with Professor Raymond Pavo and other related studies, which I will be citing as I go along the way. So data will show that while we have achieved voting gender parity, the same cannot be said about ensuring a more equitable gender distribution of candidates running for office. Female voters comprised more than half of the voting population, but only a fifth of the candidates, as you can see, who ran for elective posts were women. Out of the 8,000 plus female candidates, only half were elected into office. The fact that women make up more than half of the electorate does not necessarily mean female candidates have more chances of winning. The next two slides that I will show you will be the percentage of elected officials in the last 2019 local elections. Elected women officials barely reach the 30% minimum, critical mass to affect change. This is the global norm and the standard as indicated in the UN Economic and Social Council resolution and is reiterated with the Beijing Platform for Action. This has been the case in the past 20 years and more here in the country. In most cases, when there is an increase of women running for office, the pathway to power is through their membership to the dynastic family, framed within the bench warmer phenomenon, wherein women enter politics primarily as a seat warmer, functioning as a warm body that waits until the male member of the family or party is legally allowed to run for another term of office again, as cited in Cornell Chua's study. Women serve as breakers, which means they break their husband's, father's, or brother's term of office, or a placeholder for relatives awaiting their turn to run for office because they have reached their term limits. As this line of thinking conversely puts more expectations on women's pathways to political power, this simultaneously reinforces the dichotomy between standards placed on the shoulders of women and the less than ideal parameters placed on the male politicians. As you can see on the slide, we've never reached the 30% critical mass. As a country with the longest tradition of democratic governance in Asia, the Philippines has long recognized the fundamental value of women's political participation. Significant strides have also been made to constantly push for reforms, making it possible for women to challenge the male-dominated political space and assert themselves. Our own 1987 Philippine Constitution, just right after the People's Power, guarantees equal access to opportunities for public service for women and men. A strong legal framework and women's movement here in the country also paved the way for the legislation of other laws that ensure and enhance participation of women, such as the Women in Development and Nation Building Act of 1992, the Republic Act 7160, an act providing for a local government code of 1991. This mandates local government units to elect a representative from the women's sector to be part of the local legislative council. In addition, there is the Magna Carta of Women, provides for the acceleration of women's participation and equitable representation in decision-making and policy-making processes in government and private entities to fully realize their role as agents and beneficiaries of development. As early as 1995, the country also has a national machinery for the advancement of women, which is now known as the Philippine Commission on Women. It is instrumental in drafting the Philippine Plan for Gender-Responsive Development to address gender inequality, including in the realm of politics and governance. The basic goal of the political empowerment indicated in the PPGD framework is the empowerment of women through the full participation in political processes and structures. Full participation is dependent on women's access to literacy, information, and education. Government is also called upon to engage in affirmative action programs such as women representation in all branches of government and strengthening women's organizations. The framework also noted that how crucial voters' education and creation of women's vote are in achieving gender equality. Despite these legal frames, political parties in the country are still mostly led by men, and fielding of candidates are generally decided by men. So the passage of women's participation and representation in political parties bill that supposedly will provide for a gender quota and women's agenda inclusion in the campaign platform is yet to be realized. This will not entirely address the causes of underrepresentation as is, but it targets one major problem: political parties' selection of male candidates for election over women because of their own prejudice or sometimes in anticipation of voters' prejudice. Gender quotas, in a way, represent a jump over historical barriers to equality. They give the voters the option to choose women candidates, which they may not have had before. However, there is one city in Mindanao, south of the Philippines, which is Davao City. They have recently passed their amendment to their Women's Development Code, which includes a gender quota in decision-making bodies. Their local parties are mandated to have at least 40% of women candidates, and the city council should have at least 40% women's representation. Current enabling mechanisms in place appear inadequate to address the factors that contribute to the low turnout of women running for elective posts. The political sphere here in the Philippines continues to be male-dominated, and women intending to enter this domain are more likely to hurdle tougher obstacles towards winning an election. This particular difficulty has been likened to the glass ceiling effect, an unseen barrier that keeps women from rising to leadership position. Studies have also identified barriers or obstacles preventing women from breaking that glass ceiling. Shvedova in 2005 categorized them in three areas, which I will be using for the Philippine context: the political, institutional category, the socio-economic, and the ideological and psychological or socio-cultural categories where barriers belong. In the political institutional category, the masculine model of politics or the male-centered political culture here in the Philippines, the traditional brand of politics that has been popularly described as dominated by three Gs, which we call the goons, guns, and gold. In one of the studies of Dr. Soberchea, campaign funds are allegedly raised through gambling, prostitution, and trading of prohibited drugs, or sourced out from business people in exchange for future favors. It's so like the movies, right? So Sobrichea identified these constraints, and I'm going to mention some of it now. So persistent sexist beliefs and practices in private and public spheres, and a male-centered macho political culture, which is very much present under the existing national leadership right now. Second, male leaders as key decision maker in political dynasties and political parties. Third, increasing female representation in public leadership may not directly promote women's concern. So there is a need to develop feminist women leaders to promote women's concerns and support women's policies and programs. Next, lack of support for potential and incumbent female leaders, both from political parties and female electorate. Then divergent views and standpoints of women's groups, pernicious influence of faith-based groups on state governance, it's very strong in our country, and the real and imagined differences and tensions within and among women's groups and other organizations. So our economic, cultural reasons, hold on. Okay, so the economic cultural, for our socio-economic constraints, two reasons are very salient. Now, running for public office is very expensive in the country and entails wide network and connection and resources. And second, child and family care is still regarded as women's more important contribution to society. Care work and multiple burden, which are always expected for women to take on, also make it more difficult for them to commit to public service. Most often, their decision to enter politics come later when they are not tied up to child rearing. Lastly, for the psychosocial constraints, stereotyping, sexism, misogyny, and the double standards impede the possibility of increased women political participation. Traditionally, leadership standards have very much favored masculine associated traits. The women politicians have had to carefully calibrate the extent to which they can adopt such masculine traits. They are forced to constantly negotiate their negative framing as weak, indecisive, emotional, and soft, and being perceived also as too strong or too aggressive. Once elected, women's political capital remains unwieldy, vulnerable to sexualized attacks that are only potent when hurled at women but not at men. The macho and vicious culture of politics also turned off many aspiring female politicians. Leadership skills and capacity have to be developed and built to make them more confident, capable, and viable candidates. On top of this, they need courage and strength to endure attacks that are normally hurled at male candidates, are not hurled at male candidates. But since society does not see women as leaders and politicians, opportunities to prepare them to be capable and effective leaders are very scarce. In the recent Beijing Platform for Action Plus 25 NGO report, it's a shadow report here in the Philippines, the Foundation for Media Alternatives noted that proliferation of fake news and trolling, wherein many women face additional ridicule, judgment, or harassment from speaking out against the government, are very pervasive. The need to push for women's representation in the political arena is supported by three arguments, as Lewandowski has cited in her study. These are justice arguments, pragmatic arguments, and difference arguments. Justice argument claims that it is simply unfair for men, to monopolize representation, especially in a country that considered itself a modern democracy. This is supported by the citizenship claim that women have the same right as men in the case to run for office in a democratic system. The pragmatic argument is simply vote maximization, and that political parties fielding more women candidates are more attractive to women voters. Lastly, the difference arguments further two important features: that women will bring different style and approach to politics than men, as we have seen now, and those women are heterogeneous group who require equal descriptive representation if their diversity is to be reflected in the decision making. We have seen and read articles on how women leaders fared during the COVID-19 pandemic response. Women's leadership played a critical role towards an inclusive, effective, and equitable recovery. In the Philippines, this is also true. While the government is oblivious to the needs of women, there are women leaders who had displayed great leadership. Like the Vice President and her office, for example, provided transportation for frontliners during lockdowns, sourced out local personal protective equipments during when there was a global shortage of PPEs, and at the same time provided livelihoods to women who made these PPEs and who lost their jobs. Set up a remote consultation service with doctors when hospitals can no longer accommodate COVID cases, and conducted mobile vaccination express to speed up vaccination rollout, and a lot more. Some of the Angat Bayi women mayors, I am introducing them to you, were also recognized in their performance in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. Their feminist lens enabled them to address their constituencies' varying needs based on different identities. Since Angat Bayi started in 2018, we have capacitated 50 local women officials in more than 20 cities, 25 municipalities, and 6 provinces throughout the country. After completing the fellowship program, our fellows' track record vastly improved, as shown in the quality of ordinances they have legislated and the programs and services they were able to implement. Our fellows have successfully passed ordinances on gender-based violence response mechanism and protocol during disasters and pandemic, exploitation, the teenage pregnancy prevention, and the elimination of online sexual abuse and exploitation of children. All this happened in less than 6 months in more than 10 municipalities and cities and provinces, and in response to the urgent issue of the shadow pandemic as an impact of the global health crisis. But in electing women...
Maya, could I interrupt and ask you to wrap up?
Okay, I'm about to end also. Thank you. So, okay, but in electing women leaders, is it enough? It's not a guarantee that they will carry a gender transformative agenda. We have seen women leaders working against the passage of sexual reproductive health law and SOGI equality bill. So it is within this context that the Angat Bayi was born, and the vision of the Philippines to develop feminist leaders to strive to eliminate the barriers of and capacitating elected women leaders and young women on feminist leadership. We believe that ensuring women's political participation towards empowerment and gender justice goes beyond electing female public servants. We believe that being able to elect feminist local officials would be a decisive step towards building communities where we could walk the streets at night without fear, where our children could freely choose whom to love and not be punished for it, and where we could enjoy life's pleasure without being made to feel guilty. Thank you very much. Maraming salamat.
Thank you so much for sharing such rich stories about women and politics in the Philippines. And we would like to definitely hear more about the Angatbai experience during the discussion session. But please wait a little bit, wait a while for that. Next, I would like to introduce Ms. Sita Purnami of Women Research Institute in Indonesia. Ms. Sita participated in our first forum, in the first round, and she joined today and followed the presentations today, and she would like to quickly comment on these cases. So Sita, could I ask you to speak within 2 minutes if possible? Please, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Hello, everybody. It's I learned a lot and all of your very valuable presentations. Yeah, but actually I have prepared for 2 pages, but then I have to speak only for 2 minutes. So, but I try to be brief. It seems that my comment actually there are two. My first one, it's related with the substantive and descriptive representation. That is also that I brought up during the first round of the seminar with KWDI a couple of months ago. It seems that this substantive and descriptive representation still an issue in relation with the participation of women in the parliament. But also, this is not only being the discussion on the first round. Now it seems that today it's also become one of the issue that being discussed through all of the presentation. In Indonesia at the moment, if I may to share, we are still fighting to put the bill of the protection of domestic workers and the bill of sexual violence. Only just yesterday, the bill of sexual violence being approved to be one of the discussion in the parliament, but not the domestic workers bill. Although the domestic workers bills already been out in our, we brought up for the past 15 years, but still not being approved to be discussed in the parliament. So it is interesting through all of your experience, how then elected women can affect women's interests. The last speaker from the Philippines say that whether it's enough being women to be elected, but how then this elected women affect women's interests and improve women's problem. And this is actually the discussion on substantive versus descriptive representation. So based on that, I like to hear more actually from the speakers, based on your experience, what can be done to push to more substantive representation? It seems that this is still the big issue for all of us in the first round and also in the second round of KWDI seminar. The last point, I'm interested very much listening to what happened in Australia and New Zealand. And it seems that the situation is the same, meaning that particularly on the multiple burden faced by women between the work in the home and the workplace. So that is also become the problem that faced by women who work in the parliament, who become the parliament member, because it's still they have the multiple burden between home and the work in the parliament. So it may impact it to their contribution in their work in the parliament. My comments based on Professor Katrina and Professor Jennifer is that how about the work how about the home and workplace policy, whether the Australian and the New Zealand have that kind of, the work and family policy, whether New Zealand and Australia have already passed such regulation or law, because it's interesting to see the difference that made by Madam Jacinda, the current Prime Minister in New Zealand, which bring new air into the Parliament, where she can bring her child while she's working in the Parliament. And yeah, I'm wondering whether Australia and New Zealand has a work family policy that can open to more equal distribution of care work that may enable women to be more optimal in their work in the public space. So basically that is my comment. I hope I'm not running more than 2 minutes. So I give back to the moderator. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we just heard from Professor Curtin that she has to leave shortly. And so I would like to give Professor Curtin a chance to speak or say a few words before you leave. Professor Curtin, are you still here? Yeah, please.
Oh, yes, thank you. My apologies, but I have family responsibilities, so there we go. There's no surprise there. So we do have a childcare centre and a playground in the parliamentary precinct in New Zealand, and we've also had this Francis report that has really made 85 recommendations related to making the parliamentary culture more inclusive. So we know that who the parliamentarians can bring with them to Parliament in terms of their caregivers is shifting. We are now allowed, babies are now allowed in the house for breastfeeding and so on, which for a long time our standing orders meant that that was counted as a stranger in the house. That was the language that was used. But so 63 of the recommendations from our Francis review in 2019 to try and create a more inclusive culture and, one that is more conducive to good working practices, have 63 of the recommendations have been passed, but the remainder of them have a political dimension that's going to be very difficult for the parties to agree on. And I would just say that there is still quite a lot more at the party culture level. So I want to just quickly mention that one of the questions in the chat said, oh, what about political advisors being a channel for parliamentary careers? And I would just say that that could be a real challenge, because in the Francis review, and I think this is the same with Maria Malley's work in Australia, shows that women parliamentary advisors or political advisors are also subject to really challenging working conditions, and actually they find it they are very vulnerable in terms of being able to report difficult working conditions with their bosses who are elected members.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, and thank you for sharing these last words before you leave. We really appreciate your contribution. So we are running out of time, so I won't. And one of the important questions raised by one of our audience, Professor Curtin has addressed, and so I won't spend time in reading other questions that were raised during the forum. We have already given delivered these questions to our speakers. And so our speakers, please feel free to either answer the questions that you were given or quickly comment on other points that were raised during the forum today. I would like to start with Dr. Siedel and give you 2 minutes to give your final comments. Please.
Thanks very much. In the interest of time, I will simply give my feedback on today, and that is I'm being very intrigued by the commonality realities I've seen across the whole region. And it's really been interesting that, 5 or 6 very different countries have very similar experiences. And so in the first point, I think it's some of the stories, particularly in the Philippines, for example, really resonated with me and my experience in that common toxic culture and that rampant sexism that still exists in our parliamentary institutions and the need for cultural change. Secondly, the impact that institutional change has made on the status of women in parliament. And I'm thinking here of the proportional representation case in New Zealand and party quotas elsewhere. So that is really impactful. And thirdly, I think the importance of taking into account intersectionality in all our policy responses and understanding that women are not homogenous. And I think that is a really important takeaway from today's presentations that I will remember and that I need to learn from others here today. I think we can do better, we will do better, and we must do better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Could I ask Professor Katrina Lee Koo to quickly comment?
Thank you. I had a question regarding how we change political leadership cultures, and I'll briefly raise 4 points. Firstly, we need to think about strong leadership from the top that sets the expectation on codes of behaviour. Second, importantly, we need to set up independent reporting mechanisms. One of the issues in Australia was that people did not feel safe in terms of being able to keep their jobs if they reported bad behaviour. So having an independent reporting mechanism that people can feel confident about is important. Ensuring that there is some kind of accountability for those who are found to engage in behaviour that breaches the code of conduct is important. And lastly, it's important to have a parliamentary leadership culture that is diverse, that has values of equality and inclusion right at the heart of its core principles. So ensuring that there is a real diversity of staff. And just very quickly, in response to Ibu Sita's question about the Australian Parliament, Dr. Siddell talked right at the start about some of the initiatives around allowing breastfeeding mothers to vote in absentia in Parliament and the setting up of a childcare system. I mean, one of my hopes for the future is that some of the opportunities of COVID continue in the post-COVID era, particularly being able to work remotely and being able to work online. Australia is a very big country, so having to travel to Canberra for sitting parliaments is a great burden for parliamentarians who have to leave their families. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Adhikari, would you like to comment?
I just want to add, because everything it's so similar around the world, the situation of women, that I can resonate with everybody and what everybody is saying, even the things that I've not touched. Just one thing that was there mentioned in the question about how legally Nepal are so strong and not many political leaders have something to say. For that, one thing that is a big gap in Nepal is that women do not know what their rights are. So even if you go in an urban sphere, they do not know what their rights are. And if government is giving the provisions of whatever rights they have, if they do not know the gap between women, learning that they have the rights as well, and providing a space where they can exercise their rights, because even they have the space, they have not been to exercise the rights that they have. I think this needs to be done in Nepal. All I have to like to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Ms. Ramachandran, would you like to add any comment?
Yeah, this is with regard to, the kind of resistance that may have been felt among local communities to the Panchayati Raj, the amendment. Yes, there was resistance, but, once this law was made, then I think people started to adjust to that situation. So they quickly got their wives or sisters or somebody to participate in it. Also, under this amendment, the seats which are declared for women only, I mean, that keeps rotating. So it's not just one constituency that suffers because of the reservation for women. Yeah.
Reservation bill, right? Yeah. Thank you.
Not
Finally,
reservation bill. Yeah, the reservation bill as well as the Panchayati Raj amendment.
yeah. Okay. Miss Maya?
Yes, thank you. So I'd like to respond to the question. We started ang Atbayi program. It was inspired really by the Emily's List of the U.S. If you've known about it, it's around reproductive choice. But in the Philippines, what we did was we gather women leaders around transformative feminist leadership. We also have our mentors at first are really just a few because no one really wanted to identify themselves, or we can find women leaders who says that they are feminist leaders. But then once our batch, our fellows graduated, they became mentors already. So we have now a pool of mentors for our next batch of fellows. We have nominations for it. We call for nominations. There's a huge transformation. So if we use the feminist transformative leadership module of Sri Batliwala, if you're familiar with it. So that's what we used. And then we use also creative pedagogy. So I think what the leverage here is we started with already elected women officials. So when we transform the elected women officials, the strategy is we go to the fellows cities or municipalities and organize the grassroots women or the young women. One, we have to build a support for those feminist leaders that we've trained and capacitated. Second, we need to develop new feminist leaders, a new generation that would run alongside with the fellows that we've already trained. We haven't yet had the chance, because our program is very young, we haven't had yet the chance to monitor young women leaders who are about to run for office. Our elections is next year, but we hope that in the coming years we will be able to have young women running for office already. And then next year we are expanding towards civil servants, so training civil servants around feminist leadership. It needs deep organizing and for transformation to happen. It's not overnight. So yeah.
That sounds very interesting, to train feminist civil servants. We look forward to the outcome of that. Well, thank you very much. We are now coming to an end of the forum, and I think you can all agree that it was indeed a very insightful session, as we had anticipated. And I think today's forum, as the first round highlighted, I think it highlighted the gap between the legal provisions that exist to assist women's political participation and representation and the kind of reality, how women are represented substantively. We hope our series of forums really helped to identify common hurdles. I think it did, the common hurdles to women's political representation in the Asian region. And hopefully we'll had a chance to think about the kinds of strategies that need to be considered to overcome these hurdles. Well, before I close, I would like to invite Dr. Alexandra Seidel again. If you would like to, as a keynote speaker, if you'd like to add any final words.
Thank you very much. I just want to thank the KWDI again and all our wonderful speakers, participants on the call, on the webinar today. And again, I challenge you all to go out and to make this a really active debate in your communities. And I think we can all do it if we stick together. So thank you again for participating.
much. So with those final words, I now close our forum, Building Back Together, Building Back Better and Women's Political Empowerment in Asia. It was really great having you all here, and thank you for your contribution to this webinar. Thank you so much. See you again. Thank you.
Thank you.